Good morning, my name is Richard and I'm going to be sharing my story of salvation. This is a story that happened many years ago when I was in my teens, when I was a young man. I was brought up in fairly poor circumstances and I had no church background, no religious background. Neither of my parents attended church or read the Bible or had any real interest in God. My father was very artistic and my mother was very intellectual. She was a science teacher. She was very much into wild nature. And I developed a great love for wildlife and for, in particular, birds. I studied ornithology. So I had a great interest in these subjects. And this interest led me to asking questions. Where do we come from? What's the origin of life? And I was fed answers to these questions. I was fed evolution. I read books by famous scholars who made it their subject, evolution. Jay Bronowski, The Ascent of Man. And Desmond Morris, a book called The Naked Ape. So I read these books and I lapped it all up. And because of reading these books, and because I was going through that formative age of my life where you develop your opinions and you develop your belief systems, I developed the belief system that there was no God, that there was nothing behind life. It was just a random event. And I then began to do maybe what many people don't do when they have a belief system. I began to join the dots. And I began to think about this and I thought, well, what's the point of life? What is the meaning of life? Why should I do anything at all? Why should I obey people? Nobody's got authority. There's no ultimate authority. Why should I follow the rules of society? And I became very rebellious and a very troublesome child. I mean, up until that point, I had been a very nice child. I was involved in the St. John's Ambulance. I would go canoeing. I would do many outward activities, and I was in some ways a model citizen. But that swiftly changed. And by the time I was 14 in fact, I was expelled from school for being aggressive and abusive to teachers. I then went to college where I was thrown out of college because basically I wouldn't do the work. I didn't do any of the work. I just sat around taking drugs. And I guess because I had no foundation at all in my life, I began to look in other areas for something. And I experimented with many drugs. I became a prolific taker of drugs, and particularly psychedelic drugs and hallucinogenic drugs. I tried many different drugs just to maybe escape reality or find an alternative. But I think in my heart I was searching for something. I used to read books about how people would have experiences on drugs and how they would experience strange things on drugs. And I think there was some kind of a spiritual searching going on within my heart. But my situation grew worse and worse, and eventually, under the pretense, I had an argument with my father, which became physical, it became violent, because I was not working, I wouldn't do anything, I would just sit around and take drugs, and I was hanging out with lots of similar type people. And my father was very frustrated with me. So eventually I left the town I lived in, and I went to a town in England, in Devon, called Taunton. Now, I had a connection there. Somebody I knew was there, and I'd met them somewhere, and they'd given me a random invitation to go to Taunton. Apparently, it was a place where lots of dropouts and hippies went, and so I kind of went down there just basically to get away and to see what was going on. And when I got there, it was very basic. There was no real accommodation. We lived in a house that was empty, and somebody had managed to get into this empty house, and we were occupying this empty house. Didn't belong to us, don't know who it belonged to, and using the facilities. And that's where I was living as a 15-year-old. And one day, a young man, he was older than me, but not much older than me, and he looked very similar to me. I had long hair in those days, and he looked very similar. He was dressed similar. Arrived in the town. But he was preaching to people, he was teaching people, he was talking to people about Jesus. And he was very, very enthusiastic to share the message that he'd got and the truth that he'd found in Jesus. He'd only been a Christian for 2 weeks. 2 weeks earlier, he'd been at a pop festival, and somehow he'd met somebody, and it led to his conversion. And he was now going around the countryside, tying up with people, going to places where he knew people, and telling them about Jesus. He was a great guy, and he spoke to some of us. There was a few of us. He spoke to a group of us about Jesus. And I remember listening to him and thinking, I don't know, is this true? I don't know. And other people said, no, I believe in reincarnation. And people had various different views about what this man was saying. And so I left him and I went back to the place I was staying, and started to do my normal thing, taking drugs and hanging out. But the evening went very differently to what it normally goes. Sometimes I would not have very good experiences on drugs. But this time I was very peaceful and very calm. And I also began to realize some truths that I was trying to avoid. I began to realize that I was in a mess. This was not a good position to be in. I began to realize that I was unclean. Now, initially, my first reaction was, well, maybe physically I need a wash. So I managed to find some water in the squat that I was living in and cleaned myself up a bit. I'd let myself go. I was really going downhill. I tidied myself up, and it was quite a profound experience. It was almost like somebody was trying to tell me something. And I believe that's actually what was happening. And so I tidied myself up. And when the evening came, we normally went to one of the local drinking houses where you could buy very cheap cider. And for 2 shillings, you could get well inebriated. It was very cheap, the cider. And so we would go there. So I remember going into this place and sitting in the corner with a few of the others who were in there. And the guy that had been preaching to me came to the doorway, and he stood in the doorway of the pub. He opened the door into the pub, but he didn't come in. He stood in the doorway. And he didn't say anything. He just looked. And he kept looking, and he was staring at me. And it was strange. I thought, what's going on? You know, why is he staring at me? And he just stood there, and I began to feel that what I was being told was that I had a choice. I could follow him, I could go and go join him, or I could stay where I was. It was a very strange experience. It was almost like when Jesus called the disciples. And I knew I had to make a decision. I could stay in this lost position, in this downhill spiral that I was on, or I could follow him and find out what it was that he had, what he was teaching, what the truth was. I could follow him. And it was very clear. It was like I was choosing a path out of destruction. And as I left with him that night, and we left the town that I'd been staying in. I left behind, I had very little. I think I had a sleeping bag, and that was about it. It was the middle of summer, so fortunately it didn't matter too much. Didn't even have any shoes. I was living a very basic hippie lifestyle. And I left with him that night and walked out of that town. It was like walking out of hell. I remember it was about 11 o'clock at night, and everybody was drunk and falling out on the streets. And I realized, you know, what a place I was in, you know, that I was in a place of destruction, a place that was heading nowhere. So I left with him, and that was the beginning of my journey of Christian life. But there's something else I want to share with you that really affected this whole story. And it was that while this was all happening, unbeknown to me, my parents, who obviously were very distressed that their 15-year-old son had left home. They didn't know where I was. They didn't know what was going on with me. I could have been dead. I could have been, you know, in serious trouble. So they made an agreement. Now, these are two people who didn't go to church. They didn't pray. They didn't read their Bibles. They made an agreement, and they said, look, we have no choice. We have nowhere else to go. Let's kneel together by the side of the bed and pray and ask God to help us, to help save our son and to bring our son back. And that's what they did. They knelt by the bed, they prayed, and they asked. And while they were doing this, hundreds of miles away, God sent a young man to tell me about Jesus. Don't you think that's amazing? I think that's awesome. So God answers prayer. He answers the prayers of parents. So basically that's it. There's a lot more. That was just the beginning, but I'm going to leave it there. And I hope this blesses you. God bless. Amen.